Welcome to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome to Life Behind Bars. On today's show, we're talking all about murder with diminished responsibility and manslaughter. As always in these episodes, I'm joined by Officer Goodwin.
Good morning.
And I'm joined by Emma.
Good morning.
And today, as I say, we're going to go through that discussion. It's a penultimate show because we're coming up to the final show, which will be a biggie because it's going to be about the death penalty. So we'll obviously end there. But today we're talking, as I said, about murder with diminished responsibility and manslaughter. So maybe the best place to start is just to have a quick recap. I know we've spoken a little bit about in the series of the different types of sentences that you have. I guess starting from the bottom, which would be, in theory, I guess, like a probation or a suspended sentence. And then let's bring us up to murder, manslaughter. I guess there's a bit of a balance between actually sentences and crimes, aren't they? Because the sentence you get is
judges are limited. It
so
depends on whether you're convicted of murders, and whether it's used discretionary, whether it's a compulsory sentence, a mandatory sentence. There are guidelines that they have to use for tariff dates, but we'll discuss tariff dates as we get to that point, okay?
Yeah, I think we did pick up on that earlier in the series. I know we did. So, in theory, let me try and simplify it, because as you all know, I like simple things. That's how my mind works. Is if you kill somebody, that's murder. You've murdered somebody.
No.
But there's but there's different. Hold on. Let me simplify it. If I come across the table and I kill you, I've killed you. So therefore, I've murdered you. But there's different levels of murder in the sense of how responsible I am for it, or whether I intended to do it, i.e. whether it was an accident, I might have intended to do you harm but not necessarily kill you type of stuff. And then there's all the other aspects that come into it about, as I say, about was I responsible for it, what the emotional state was, what the conditions were and such like that. Is that fair?
Sort of.
Correct, maybe I should say.
It isn't quite the way I'd interpret that.
Okay, well, why don't
because you may be coming across here to hurt me, unaware that you're going to kill me. Because you're angry at me for some reason. So in the initial emotion of that thing, you've come across, you can see it, we've all seen it on TVs, we've seen it in real life and all that stuff, but you had no intent, you intended to hurt me, but you didn't intend to kill me. So you can't always assume that because somebody's coming to do something that you can class it as a murder, because it isn't. In that sense, is it? Murder is based on intent.
And that's
where you have to prove that in law.
And that's where I wanted to get you to, because I guess in the simplest instance, if you kill somebody, whether you intended to kill them or not, you've killed someone.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily murder. And it's all around the wording
there's a slight difference. It isn't always with the intent to murder or to kill somebody. It's classed as fully intent. It can be based on murder if you go and harm somebody knowing that it's likely that they may die or will die from what you do, like knocking somebody off the road at 80 miles an hour in a car, and you bump them off the road, you will know that that's likely to cause their death. So you could be charged with murder under the grounds that your intention of doing so much damage that you were not even taking into consideration the risk to that life, which is basically the same thing as a murder thing. So it can be for that. Even though in your own head you might have bumped them off, they say, well, you would have known that is...
The level of damage.
The level of damage is likely to cause death. So therefore it's intentional. You intended for that.
There was a case. It's not a murder case, but there was a case. It was maybe about a year ago. I think I was reading about it, and there were a group of girls. They were jumping off a bridge about 20 foot into a river or a pond type of stuff. It was a hot day, and they were just taking it to jump off. And one of them was stood on the top, and she was kind of like, I'm going to do it. And it was like, oh, I don't want to do it. And one of her friends pushed her, and she pushed her. So she didn't have any control over how she was falling. She hit the water at such an angle that it broke her back and it paralysed her and she wasn't able to walk. And her friend was sentenced, I can't remember how long she was given, it wasn't a huge amount of time, but she was sentenced to prison for, I'm not sure exactly what the crime was. It wasn't an attempted murder thing, it was like an ABH type of stuff.
Or it comes under something like reckless behaviour. Yeah,
but and the whole point was that, because her friend was like, but it was just a joke, it was just something funny. Like, yes, it was. In your intent,
yes.
And actually, maybe what's more prevalent, I guess, here is, do you remember? And again, it must have been a couple of years ago. Those kids on the bridge that were throwing stones off the bridge at cars on the motorway.
Yeah.
and a car went underneath. I think they threw a brick and it went through the windscreen, and the guy crashed and he died.
Yeah.
And it was like 4 or 5 kids, and they were all sentenced for, I don't know if it was a murder or a manslaughter.
I suspect it would have been manslaughter.
Yeah. So,
but
is that based on the fact that they didn't go out with the intent to kill someone? To them, it was just a bit of a laugh, and they weren't thinking of the consequences, which I don't know whether we blame their parents for or blame school for. I'm not, or society. I don't know.
Well, that's where that little bit comes in with murder, knowing that your actions are likely to cause death will put you in that frame.
Yeah, so it's either intending to kill, or know
Remember,
that this has got a risk of ending it.
It's difficult, not so much for the police, but it's very difficult. CPS decide on what gets charged, particularly on capital murders, capital offences. And it must be difficult because they have to make a decision, because it doesn't matter what you know, it's what you can prove that matters. So they might go, well, that's not the point here. We take a big risk with such small amounts of information to charge somebody with murder that the jury may be likely to bring back a not guilty plea. And once you've done that, we can't come back to revisit this. Whereas they go, but it may be easier for us to either prove manslaughter or get a manslaughter charge.
So trying to prove that those kids went out with the intent to murder this individual.
What you can prove that counts.
You're
never
not
going to
prove that, because actually that's not what they did. They didn't go out to murder this guy. They went out to throw stones off a bridge at cars without thinking about it. I guess that comes down to, because I was about to ask the question and you've answered it there, is whether this is an age thing. Because if you have a group of 13-year-olds, for example, part of that argument by the defence solicitors will be, well, they don't know any better, they're too young. Whereas if you have somebody that's in their 40s that is older, therefore they're deemed to have more life intelligence, then the defence is harder, but the argument is still the same. Well, he just went to throw stones at cars. He didn't go to kill anybody.
When it comes to age and things like that, though, the legal term is mens rea. So they have to have what's called mens rea, which is the enough understanding, and that's about their responsibility, about their, whether that's intellectual, whether it's an emotional thing, whether it's a mental health thing, to be able to be sentenced to whichever level of crime.
Understanding consequences, I suppose, isn't it?
And
but remember, that's set at the age of 10 in this country.
I was going to say, isn't it 10 or 12?
10 years old, the age of legal.
10 years old, you've got legal responsibility.
They'll still do the mental, but they will look at the 10 and say you are responsible for your behaviour in law. However, some judgments have to be made then about your understanding of the consequences of the behaviour you do.
Yeah, and obviously the sentencing would then be, well, we're not going to put an 11-year-old into big prison, into real jail, because they're just not going, that's Georgian times, isn't it? You can't put 11-year-old boys into prison with 30-year-old men that are hardened criminals that have been doing this for a while and been in that. It just the environment would not work. We know that from the Georgian system.
No, and the 10 is deemed that they know right from wrong. But as Graham said, then it's about how much they understand the consequences of their actions.
See, I always said it's really dangerous to set an age, just an arbitrary age like that, without some other adjustment. Because at 10 years old or 11 years old or 12 or 13, children's appreciation of the consequential behaviour is not the same as everybody's, because they're all led either by their parents or by their friends. So we might educate our children to understand about rights and wrongs and responsibilities and good behaviour, and even our kids might get it wrong when they go to secondary school because they're influenced by others. And they always say that once a child steps into places like secondary school, there is a bigger influence on their behaviour and thinking than your own parents have on you, which is why children come home and keep secrets. They don't tell you what goes on in school unless you're really good at communicating with your child. Why? Because they suddenly get loyalty sits there and not with parents. Children never have a loyalty with their parents when they're young. You're just their parents. And you are the people that look after them.
I know you say this.
There's no relationship as we understand it like that.
Yeah, sorry. Go on. Graham's got this great thing that he talks about when he does the tours about how primary school children, and sometimes year 7s, but certainly primary and to a degree year 7s, loads of questions, really kind of fire questions off, and some really interesting questions. And university students, loads of questions. Everything in between. When you ask, oh, guys, got any questions? They all kind of very sheepishly sort of like hands in pockets, heads down, don't look. And it's because, you always say it's down to the reasoning that they're a bit nervous to ask questions, because you've suddenly got your peers and everyone around you going, like, who then might be like, well, it was a silly question, or like you might get teased for it. So suddenly you're very self-conscious and very self-aware oh, if I ask this, what's everyone around me, what's their response going to be? Which is why you tend to get the clowns of the class and the jokers end up being the ones that people sort of see somewhere at the top, because you say something and everyone laughs and it's like, oh cool, I made people laugh, and euphoria happens and everyone feels good because obviously the serotonin release in the brains and stuff like that, everyone's laughing, so therefore it's good. And it's not until they become so disruptive, completely off the point, it's not until those children become so disruptive that other kids start to get annoyed and go, actually I'm trying to learn it.
But it is relevant. It's relevant in the sense that if you go back to the 1960s and more recently, where we've had 3 people at the age of 10 or 11 locked up for murder.
Yeah.
The previous one in the 60s was Mary Bell.
Yes.
Mary Bell was responsible for killing 2 young children.
We spoke about in the serial killer episodes.
That's right. Yeah. And then the more recent one was the young Jamie Bulger. Those 2, I forgot their names now. Johnson
Robert.
Either way.
John Venables and Robert Thompson.
Yeah. But they were 10 years old.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get into the discussion about, but it's about consequential thinking, isn't it? And we don't know, in the real world, we have to be honest and understand and say, we don't know the level of understanding that our children have got, depending on the families, the area, and the attitudes that they grow up with.
And children develop differently anyway.
Yes.
And so those influences then are going to influence how quickly they can pick things up. But then when they're ready to pick things up is different. So these kind of cut-off ages, it's across our society that though, isn't it? It's the same with the schools, which is why within schools you've got the self-conscious ones in that age gap. Because in that age point, they're all expected to be able to do this. Just like in law, it's like at 10, right, you know right from wrong. It's
That's
like
right, yeah.
things aren't quite as clean cut as that.
Yeah, they're not.
Last night or this morning, they just arrested a 16-year-old boy.
I saw that
for
the two stabbings.
Stabbings. We don't know whether it's murder yet. We don't know what it is. Newspapers are really not very good at this, but they've arrested, and they say...
What, you mean telling things accurately?
Yeah.
It's not just papers.
Putting a spin on it.
Any news channel anywhere
The police believe it's
good at
fake.
it.
We don't know yet whether there are other people involved, because there was a 4x4 going on around the streets. So there may have been adults involved in this, and we don't know whether there's an adults in there controlling that by sending that person out to do something, either to prove themselves or to initiation gangs or part of a gang that's easily manipulated and controlled. We have no idea. But I'll guarantee you on that internet, the minute it's allowed to be broadcast up, who the name is and what's that, everybody will have an answer. Mm-hmm. Everybody except the people sitting in the jury in the court will have an answer. They'll all know what should be done. And they'll have how do you know that? You have no information about this. You have no idea what... and we get frustrated with the police. Well, they should be doing that and doing that. They are. But they can't just do it tomorrow. They have to wait for evidence. They have to wait. They know who they're looking for half the time, but they're waiting for the right times.
It doesn't matter what you know, it matters what you can prove.
What you can prove, so they'll wait until they've got good, strong... Because once you arrest them, you've only got a limited time you can question them before you have to release them. And that's really...
They had that with the... there was another one the other day, wasn't there? We were discussing it. It was... was it the fire? I think it was the fire, wasn't it? Where the two children and the mother had died, and they had the guy on. They had the guy held for a couple of days, for it's like 48 hours. Then they asked for the extension. They got the 36-hour extension. They run it right up to us. They're also trying to build all the evidence, and then they charged him with murder.
Yeah. And the danger is, if you've got that limited time, but you're struggling and you arrest people too soon, and you're really struggling to pull that really good evidence in. Once you release them, you've got a real problem now, haven't you? Because the CPS will make a decision whether to charge or not then. And it's not, so there's a real danger with that. And I think we all get a little bit, we want people, police and the to do it immediately. And why are they waiting, and why aren't they arresting all these people? They go, because they need to be sure. Because if you can't charge them with the thing you want to charge them with, you may have to charge them with something of a lesser nature. And then people go, well, that's not fair. They should have been charged with that.
This is one of the problems.
It's a rock and a hard place, isn't it?
Because I think that the two biggest, I'd have to fact check it, but I think the two biggest crime challenges they have between the police and the CPS are rapes and sexual assaults, because they're so hard to prove unless you've got the DNA evidence. And even then, it's a he said, she said type of scenario.
Absolutely, one-on-one.
And it becomes so hard. And what tends to happen, or what can happen, is the CPS look at it and go, we just don't think we're going to get a conviction here. and therefore it's not worth the
They say it's not in the public's interest.
because it's about money.
Yeah.
Because it comes back down to that tax.
And it's about winning and losing
therefore,
as well.
and ultimately, yes, they don't want to do something they don't think they're going to win, but there is also a cost associated to every single court case that happens, so they just don't bother. And then it just goes nowhere. Whereas with what we're talking about, obviously with murder with diminished responsibility, there's a body, there's generally a lot more DNA evidence, there's generally a lot more that happens. There's a lot less unsolved murders that happen nowadays. I don't even hear about them, but there's not many.
It becomes a lot more complicated because let's put murder to one side now as a single separate charge. You're either guilty or you're innocent of committing that murder. And you move into manslaughter now.
Yeah.
But you've got discretionary manslaughter. You've got what they call involuntary and involuntary manslaughter, and they do bring different sentences because there's a different sense of responsibility. But you've also got corporate manslaughter. Now, no one has ever gone to prison for corporate manslaughter because you don't charge the individual, you charge the company.
Yeah.
So companies are held to account. So as the manager or a runner or the CEO or whoever's running that, if they run a business that actually is extremely dangerous to people's health and life and they die, they won't be affected other than having their company taken as corporate manslaughter.
Yes.
And it nearly only ever ends up in either a very large fine, more than anything else.
Yeah, improvement in safety practices and like you say, a large fine.
Yes.
It does end up with the current CEO or whoever it is getting ousted, but that's probably more of a PR thing potentially. But no, you're absolutely right about it. We see that happen. There was a guy that got crushed by the forklift, where his forklift went down the thing, and I think the company was held responsible for that. There was again a few years ago, but there was a guy that fell into a silage pit. Yeah, and he died. I knew a guy that I used to work in a yogurt factory with, whose arm went into a machine. He lost his arm. Yeah. Funny enough, he still works.
And they go, is that? Well, they look at things. Health and safety then look at things like what we call is reasonably practicable. Yeah. It's an old thing I did when I was doing health and safety in the prison. What's reasonable for an employer to do should be done.
God, the risk assessments for prison officers must be pretty extreme, eh? You know what I mean? It's not many jobs like that.
If it's reasonably practicable to do it and you didn't do it, then you'll go, that's now manslaughter charge. Why? Because you could have prevented that. If they look at it and go, no, they did all the safety things that was possible to do at a reasonable level, it's the employees that refused to not, when not being supervised, not to follow those, then you find it's not so easy to start charging people with corporate manslaughter.
So you get that either accidental thing or that they've not been responsible with their own actions.
Yes.
So they not follow the processes that are there.
Yeah, if the processes are in place, you've been trained, you don't follow it, then there's this different levels. I mean, again, slightly off point before we take a break, but I know that one of the things we had, I laugh about it because it sounds so crazy, and I know when I speak to people out there, like that can't be a real thing. But I don't know if you both remember when we first started running Shrewsbury Prison as a tourist attraction, we were doing paranormal investigations. I had to spend a lot of time with insurers and a lot of time in the health and safety world about whether we could get like a ghost insurance. And it was all based around, because we had an incident here quite early on when we first started where somebody got possessed. I'm not going to say whether they did or whether they didn't, but they got possessed. I remember they stood up, and I remember the incident. I wasn't there, but I remember the write-up. They stood up and they suddenly went a bit crazy and they went white and everything like that, and they ran into a wall and they cut their head and they fell over, and then they came back to and they were fine, other than the cut on their head. They had a physical injury. And there was this thing going, well, who's responsible for that? Because it's like, well, if someone just runs into a wall, then you'd kind of be like, well, they're responsible. But in their perspective, they weren't in control. A spirit had taken over their body. And I remember sat there with our operations director at the time and sort of going, how do we write a risk assessment on this? I remember having conversations with the insurance company and the insurance brokers. The insurance brokers were like, what? Like, what? And no one had really come up against this before, and we were having to figure out what that looks like to make sure that we were limiting the responsibility to the company, because it was just so bizarre. And that's a very extreme
when you can't do a risk assessment on something such as that, because some things you just can't do a risk assessment to make it and go, we can do that. That's when you have disclaimers put into place. Well, because disclaimers take the place of I can't alter something running into a wall.
Do you know what? Again, I've spoken with the insurance company, because when we do like axe throwing and we have disclaimers, and the bottom line is a disclaimer has never and will never stand up in court. Yeah. If I get you to sign a disclaimer that says you're going to do this activity and you take full responsibility on the assumption that we've trained you correctly and you've not followed our instructions.
So who should we charge if somebody picks up one of your axes up there and they're playing a game and suddenly their heads pop and they decide to start chopping other people?
Well, that's different.
Because will they say to you,
that's different.
Will they say,
that's
did
different.
you take the appropriate measures to isolate each of these groups so this person couldn't
Well,
run around with the axe?
that's the same.
And
The argument would be that you're over 16, so there's nothing stopping you going into B&Q, buying an axe, walking out and starting chopping people's heads off. That wouldn't be us. But and what I'm saying about disclaimers, what could happen, for example, is we could say, right, you sign a disclaimer to say that any incident or anything, if you do not, and the disclaimer can't just say you take full responsibility. That's not a real thing. Even if you sign something that says that, it's not a real thing.
You take all preventive
It can say that if you do not follow the procedures, the training, and everything we put in place to say to you, this is how to do it, then you're responsible.
Yeah.
Now that's what would be classed as a real disclaimer. If you then go into throw an axe, and you do it wrong, let's say, or you throw it and it bounces off and it hits you in the leg, or you throw it and it goes in and you go to pick it up, and you don't listen to the instructions and you cut yourself off, that type of stuff. You're injured, for example, and you decide that you're going to take us to court because you see that's our fault. We pull out that disclaimer. Really, that's going to get thrown out quite quickly, because the reality is they're going to go, well, how long was the training session? How long do you train your staff to do this? How was it? And it's not just that, but what things were in place to prevent that from happening? And the disclaimer really goes out the window, because we've looked at it and we've run different events where we've gone, this is really hard to do, especially like the zombie events in the dark and kind of those environments. We'll put disclaimers in place. And the insurance company go, you can do that. The reality is, if you end up in a court, that disclaimer probably isn't really going to be taken into consideration. It's going to be dismissed, because you cannot stand there and go, sign this piece of paper, you're now responsible. In other countries you can, and we hear about it when people go bungee jumping or they go skydiving or whatever it is, you sign a disclaimer and boom. Different countries, different laws. New Zealand, for example. New Zealand don't have a corporate... I can't remember what it is. Basically, if in the UK, you
there'll be different levels of. They'll call it different things.
In the UK, if you walk down the street,
corporate manslaughter,
and there's a hole in the street, like they dug a hole, a manhole, for example, so that, and you trip in it, you can sue the local council and the company doing the works. And if they've not properly signposted it and stuff like that, you can sue them, and you'll win. In New Zealand, if you do the same thing, they turn around and go, well, you should have seen the hole. Yeah. You should be walking with your eyes open. You're responsible for your own behaviour.
Every country makes its own laws.
That seems so intelligent, but you can't sue each other for civil cases. And
I got a question for you, because you dealt with life sentence prisoners a lot in your time when you were down at Chapter Mallet. And when you were doing all those interviews, even though that they might have been convicted of a murder, there's other life sentence prisoners, of course, but for murder, did you ever find within those conversations you were having, they were always trying to get to convince you that, lean towards that it was actually manslaughter and not murder, in the hope, even though they know it's a charge of murder and guilty of, they try that it may reflect how you write your parole reports for the parole board, to get you to psychologically lean towards that, well, it's not as cold and as brutal, and not taking responsibility for their crimes, even though they've been charged with murder, because there's a huge amount of denial.
There's a real mix.
There's a huge amount of denial with people that actually commit murder, particularly if they're not a criminal in the first place, and they're not running around with that kind of lifestyle, and they do actually end up being charged with murder as a one-off in their lives. They must live with a huge amount of denial in their own mind themselves, that they can't believe that they've done this. It could be somebody they know very well.
I'm desperate for this answer. I'm going to stop you, because we're so far past a break. Emma will absolutely answer it as soon as we come back from the break. We'll hear from her first, but I'm going to have to put a break in. Otherwise, our sponsors they'll ditch us, and then none of us can continue to put petrol on our Ferraris, and,
pay up,
fill our swimming pools, and jet off around the world.
Put in the billing later on. Pay up. Sponsors,
you've got to get knee surgery. Do you know what I mean? That's
I know.
So we've got to get
twice.
We've got twice. I've got two knees. Take a break. Front and back. So we're taking a quick break. And we'll be back right after these messages.
You are listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Unlock the past and discover what life was like at Shepton Mallet Prison. Relive the history of past prisoners over the last 400 years. Experience what a Victorian prison cell was like for those incarcerated. See where executions were carried out. Walk the landings and prison wings. You'll hear stories of those who worked and lived behind its high walls. See it, touch it, feel it on a journey of discovery at the nation's oldest prison. Visit sheptonmalletprison.com today to find out more.
You're listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome back to Life Behind Bars. We're here in part 2. If you can hear the clicking, I'm just going to throw it in. If you can hear that constant clicking, it's actually one of the heaters because we're in a studio. It's quite a good size, but it's really cold because
you can't see it from your folks.
We're in a prison.
It's the place. It's a thing in the corner with a few flames licking up. Right where the door is.
Doesn't matter if it's got
right where the door is. You can't get out.
It's warm though, isn't it? Would you prefer it to be warm or cold?
Die warm. That's what I say.
There's some corporate manslaughter responsibility in that. Emma, just before we took the break, Graham asked you a question.
Non-responsibility.
Yeah.
There's a real mix. I mean, more of the reports I wrote were actually on people who've committed sexual offences than murder, to be fair. Okay. But even so, there was a number that had done it, and there was a real mix. I remember working with somebody who'd been in prison for longer than I was alive, and he was in for killing a police officer, and even when I was there, was still saying that the police officer fell on his knife. And you just think, you've been in prison for like 40 years.
Did you say the police officer fell on his knife?
Yeah.
Can you just...
But the question I'd ask with that is he telling you that because he wants to justify to you that it wasn't as serious, or justify to themselves? Have they started to believe their own story? If I say to myself enough, he fell on his knife, they do say that at a psychological level, you can actually convince your own brain that the thoughts that you now have are the truth, as opposed to what it would have been originally.
I think he had convinced himself.
Yes.
There was less extreme cases.
Yes.
If you tell yourself something enough, eventually you believe it.
Yes, it becomes the new narrative in your mind.
There was more mental health there, I'm sure.
It's a simple example.
And he'd been in prison since like
but
the 60s.
But that is a case.
And then there were some people that had, accounts that more of that kind of was the intent there, or was it more
struggling to face up to their actual actions,
or was it like an assault or a GBH that has ended up in murder?
Well, we did discuss it before the show started, where I said that we had a guy here that was here. It was either his partner or it was the partner, the lovers. He went home and caught compromising situation and all that. But it was a couple of days. He went away and he come back a couple of days with a shotgun. He found his wife.
And
then he killed, and he got charged with manslaughter.
Just because that, I know what you're talking about because we discussed it before the show, but these guys won't. So you're talking about an instance where a guy went home, found his wife in theory, basically in bed with another man.
Yep.
And then rather than react at that point, he
went off, come back a couple of days later with a shotgun.
Went away, came back 2 days later with a shotgun.
Went back, that's bang. And he got manslaughter charged for that.
Killed her.
Because the argument would be, well, you actually, I think it was, because he wouldn't have been there all the time. But with the intent, you went there with the intent of picking up this shotgun, knowing what shotguns are designed for, walking or going back to that place, picking it up, and you go, well, that must be intent. But that's when it gets complicated, doesn't it? Because that's when...
I don't think so. What you're saying is...
But that's when the psychologists and the psychiatrists...
How long does diminished responsibility last?
How do you know how long somebody could lose the sense of the real world and thinking? Is it a couple of days and you must be all right after that? We don't know.
And that really depends. Because when you look at domestic violence cases and you get that prolonged amount of abuse or mental abuse, and people can crack under that, and it's like, and diminished responsibility is about not being able to be accountable.
Yeah, because bereavement can go for ages. Let me ask you this: what is the? And I think you're pretty much answering that. What is the actual kind of line in terms of what is diminished responsibility yes, it means that I'm not as responsible, but what is it that allows me to say, well, it's diminished responsibility because was an emotional mess, or
it's the mental capacity to understand
what you're about to be doing next
and what
is
you're
not
doing.
is wrong.
What I'm doing, or what the consequences of what I'm doing.
Well, I think if you can think of the consequences, then they might say, well, if you understand the consequences of your actions, it may not be. But then you don't know, because somebody goes, I know I've got to do this. And they already know that they're probably going to get caught for it. But they don't think about their actions, the consequences of their actions to themselves, to other people. Who knows? It's really difficult.
Because it becomes
You
so
hear the
complex.
cases of, if you think about in films where people are kind of almost out-of-body experiences,
Yeah.
that kind of, I'm not
But
in
then
control of
do
what's
people
going
then
on
pretend
right now.
that so they don't get...
Yeah.
It's not so much in the UK, because ultimately we don't have a death penalty, but if you're in a country that has a death penalty, and if I get found guilty for murder, I'm going to get executed, whereas if I get found guilty for murder with diminished responsibility, or I think in America it's the insanity.
Well, you have first, second and third degree
Yeah,
murders.
but they're insanity pleas and
It's the
stuff
same
like that.
thing.
So it's not my first degree, but it's insanity plea or whatever it might be. So therefore I'm going to pretend, or I'm going to make out that, I don't have it should be
lesser
diminished.
sentence.
It should be diminished.
But there was a case some years ago now of a woman, I think she was well into her 40s, and she literally stabbed her husband to death a number of times while he was asleep in bed. And she got charged and found guilty of murder and got sentenced appropriately. But she fought the case for years, and eventually, I think she served about 8 years in prison, and she won her appeal based on diminished responsibility. Because when they looked into the whole history of that relationship, she had suffered appalling abuse, appalling domestic violence. And just even though she might have stepped out of her doors every day, gone to work, and appeared to be living as a reasonable person without any problems, you have no idea there's two things going on. It's like split personalities in a way. And she was just there one night and decided she couldn't do this anymore. I'm not going to live this anymore. Now, there's always the argument, like comes up, well, you should have left. You should have.
You can't do that, though.
Nothing is as easy as that.
And the level of abuse in a case like that, you're not going to know outside the
And it could be
the whole point
psychological
of the
more than
abuse.
physical.
And both the abuse of that sort is hidden. That's the whole.
It nearly always is.
It's not very visible, because otherwise there would be things.
Yeah, there's
people
always
could
the
help.
sort of normality going on.
There was another one recently again, and I think it's come back up again. It was a few months ago. It came back up because it was one of the things I remember saying to you about this show about maybe for series 2 we should be picking up on things like in the current media and doing it like week on week, so rather than recording 10 episodes. Because with this show at the moment we've recorded 10 episodes over an 8-week period, and they'll go up, so not as relevant in terms of what we could be talking about. And there was the lady who killed her husband. She stabbed him multiple times, and then she rang the police, or she rang the ambulance and said, my husband, I've just stabbed my husband.
Yes.
And they go, is he still breathing? She's like, I hope not.
Yes.
And they were like, well, we're going to send an ambulance. She
Yes.
goes, don't. And when they turned up, and even then the whole police recordings and stuff, and they turned up, she goes, is he still alive? And they're like, he's still alive. She said, just leave him.
Yes.
Let him die.
Yeah.
And it turned out that he'd been abusing her for years, physically and emotionally, and everything like that. And she wanted him. She was there saying, I want him to die. Let him die. He deserves to die, type of stuff. I'm not sure what she actually ended up getting. I don't think it was a murder. I think she ended up getting a manslaughter because of the abuse. And what was really interesting for me was how the kids kind of responded to the situation. How their children
always know what are going on in these relationships.
Yeah, and it was such a big thing in the sense of, the fact that you've done it and you're on the phone going, yeah, I've just done it, and he deserves to die, and I want him to die, and I don't want you to come, type of stuff. But at the same time, she made the decision to make the call whilst he was still alive, rather than wait until he died and then make the call. And I wonder whether those.
Well, you might say, well, that's a disturbed mind that isn't able to put it in its place.
It's not matching what her wishes and her behaviour.
No,
quite
and plus,
aligned,
we don't know what the fear factor was. Said, well, if he doesn't die, I'm going to, because when he gets better,
he'll kill me.
You could possibly the children as a punishment, because that's another crime in its own right, and it generally seems to be men more than women, but I'm not saying it doesn't happen the other way, where men go and they kill the children and then commit suicide as a punishment to the mother. a lifelong punishment of losing her kids, which some people in their deranged minds would go, well, that's a far greater punishment than me killing you and letting the children grow up.
Do you know what, and
so you can see there's some very twisted thinking going on with people, isn't there?
There's
anger and revenge.
Case you were talking about, sorry, just to link with what we were talking about in terms of murder and manslaughter. I don't know what she got, but
I'd have to check.
The thing with manslaughter is there isn't the intent to kill, whereas like diminished responsibility is where something's happened, but you've
been
not
driven
got the responsibility level. They're
so it's murder with diminished responsibility.
Whereas manslaughter, again, you've still got diminished responsibility within that, and you've got voluntary and involuntary.
Yeah.
So voluntary is where you have intended harm. But not death.
You know the danger.
Involuntary is like reckless driving and you've killed someone, but there was no intent of harm, no intent of anything, but you've killed someone.
Because if we look back to Ian Huntley, and again I would have to check, but did he end up with manslaughter?
No, Ian Huntley was charged. Ian Huntley?
Yeah.
No, he was charged with double murder, wasn't he?
Well,
and he's been given a whole life tariff.
No, but I wasn't sure if that's what ended up happening, because I remember his defence, his claim was, well, I didn't mean to kill them. Initially, he was obviously saying...
I do remember that.
And it was like, I didn't mean to kill them, and therefore the CPS have to make that decision and go, well, we have to prove that he did this with intent and he meant to. Yes. He went out to do this. And actually, sometimes I assume, it must happen, the CPS will look at this and go, this person's saying they didn't mean to do it. We know we can get a manslaughter without intent, and we can get this sentence with very little effort because they're going to plead to that, or we can try and fight this. And therefore the CPS go, that's the easier route, let's do path of least resistance.
The problem with that argument, and it was a very weak argument on his part, is that I didn't intend to do it. So you didn't intend to do it twice?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I got it.
And it sounds... but
the Jamie Bolger case...
You're probably right in this, or appreciate what I'm saying. There is a lot of cases going on when people that are committing those kind of crimes, their prime motive is the sexual element of that. That's their prime, that's the driver for them to go and do that offence. The problem is when they've finished that prime motive and they've satisfied that, now they're left with a problem. And their problem is called two witnesses. And then another set of thinking processes take place then, don't they?
Protect themselves.
Because you don't know what's going on in there, but it's like all things. So sometimes I'm not saying it's happened in this case, but I'm saying there are examples where these things become afterthoughts because you're left with a thing there. A problem in that sense. I'm not trying to dismiss this because it's a horrific offence. And quite rightly he's there for the rest of his life and never ever get out of jail.
Well, I think we'll have, his name will definitely be popping back up.
It will. But the reality is, so...
There's different motivations, isn't there? So like the key motivation in some offences will be sexual, and then there might be a death as a result of the crime, or a death to cover up the crime, or it might be...
Ian Brady fully expected those children will be dying as well. That was the whole process, as it was with Fred West. Yeah. Fred West, none of these were afterthoughts. These were the whole part of the start and the finish of the process. He'd probably even planned out the burial sites before he'd taken the next victim through the door. Already knew what he was going to do.
The control and the power and all of that is part of
and the finality of it all.
Well, let's come back to some of these, because I know in the next show, so I'm just looking at time, I know in the next show that, when we talk about the death penalty, it'll be probably quite heated at points, but some of these names are going to come back up. Now, I think and again, we should say that, we're talking very kind of loosely, and I think, we're talking about criminals are one thing, but actually we need to take the time to think about the victims and also the victims' families, because we're talking about people in instances here who parents, siblings, the family, friends are very much still alive. And actually, there's some surviving victims. Well, I know with Fred West, there are some people that survived and they're still very much living in the area. So I think, we need to take that moment to recognise that the
appalling nature of these
things. And obviously everything we talk about here is about trying to bring forward... we call it life behind bars, but it's much broader than that, because obviously if we just concentrated on prison, it would actually be quite a very quick show and quite a quick series. It's everything wrapped around it. And I think
the
But as
wider
difficult as
impact
these
on
subjects
people.
are, it's important that they're discussed.
Oh, absolutely.
And keep your emotions away from
they
these
say
things.
if you
Because
if
once
you
emotions
don't-
get involved,
Yeah, and
then
if
thinking
you-
gets distorted.
If you hide history,
Yeah.
you just make the same mistakes again.
Yes, you do.
You need to look at history, which is why I think things like Auschwitz is such an important space
Never to
for
forget.
people to be able to visit. And I know there's a bit of controversy about whether you should. That they do it so well. In the sense of where you can and can't take photos, how it's done, and there's a level of expectation of people to take appropriate photos if you can take them. And actually, in the grand scheme of it, if you look at it, there's very few photos of Auschwitz online and on social media. I mean, if you compare it to like our attractions, for example, and I use the word attraction, which I wouldn't use for Auschwitz, very different, but it's so important that those things are talked about and are put out there, because it prevents them from happening.
You're talking about sort of mass murder there, aren't you? But
I'm just utilising the fact of if we didn't talk about...
I want to put something in.
If we didn't talk about...
Yeah.
If we didn't talk about Fred West or Ian Huntley, then because you don't talk about it, it's almost like it never existed.
Yes.
And actually, therefore, it's just starting to happen again. And it's things like with... very quickly, I saw Catherine Ryan was talking about last week on a interview, I think it was with Louis Theroux. She was talking about a comedian that is a very high-profile comedian that everybody knows is a sexual predator, but they're too rich, their lawyers are too good, so on and so forth. And I'm just like, haven't we heard this before? This feels just like a Jimmy Savile.
Yeah.
It feels just like all the different cases happening sort of throughout the US, the whole Me Too movement. I'm like, so you've kind of started this, and I get why you might not be able to make that way forwards, but if history's told us anything, it should be that you can press this forwards and just not
take the next step.
Yeah.
But we've been talking about murder and manslaughter, but we've forgotten one of them. When we think about it, we've forgotten about one where, in actual fact, the government legalised murder.
Yeah.
War.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It doesn't matter how you cut this piece of cake. When you put a gun in someone's hand, I understand the law creates a defence system and defending country and people, but you're still putting something in someone's hand to go out there intentionally to kill somebody else without emotion, without anger, without relatively justification, because as a soldier or a service person, your government are justifying this crime that you're committing for you. Or not crime, but they commit
give you
murder
the
for
license
you.
to do it. Yeah.
So people forget that when you look at that, you go, we're intentionally killing people. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to argue we shouldn't or should do those things. That's the way the world lives. But it's always strange that we live in a country where we talk about the sanctity of life and the importance of life and death and all those things, and yet there are wars going around all around the world all the time. They never stop. The world is at war, but it's just not at war as two groups of people against each other. Yeah. In Africa, there's a dozen wars going on there. We know we've got Eastern European country going on war.
Russia,
you go down to South America, you've got all the private armies and all the different groups are fighting wars. And you go, so we're killing each other at a phenomenal rate. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand, as a human race, you can't just go, well, we'll make it all, can't make it all against the law. You're not allowed to go to war. It would be nice if we could do that, of course. Would be nice if you say it.
That's what they say about what if the school and hospitals had all the money they needed for equipment and books and everything they needed to be able to do that, and the army had to do fundraisers for guns.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute. Let's take a quick break there. Let's have a quick word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back after this.
You are listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome to Shrewsbury Prison, Shropshire's #1 tourist destination. Step behind the gates of this 200-year-old prison and discover an unknown world. Heritage tours run by ex-officers, where you can see the cells, walk the landings, see and touch the history. But there's so much more going on. Experience one of our brilliant activities or take part in our world-renowned events. From escape rooms to axe throwing, overnight sleepovers to prison break, we do it all. And there's something for all the family, with activities starting from 8 years, events from 12 years, and heritage tours for all ages. Visit our restaurant and experience food behind bars. There really is so much to see, do and discover on a day out at Shrewsbury Prison. Visit us at www.shrewsburyprison.com.
You're listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome back to Life Behind Bars for part 3. Today we're talking about manslaughter, we're talking about murder with diminished responsibility. We've spoken in depth about various different bits, and I want to make sure we get this in because it is a subject. I'm not 100% sure why I'm not sure if fascinated is the right word. It's definitely not infatuated. I'm not sure why, for me, this is such a big case. But the case of Ruth Ellis. Now, we use this case, actually, we do at Shrewsbury Prison and at Shepton Mallet Prison, we do a mock court case, effectively, that people can come and take part in as a corporate company or as schools and such like that. And we use Ruth Ellis as one of those cases. And we use the actual case, the actual setup, the whole process, so they're doing a real thing. And I think for me, the case was such of its time that even the judge didn't want to sentence her to death, but had no choice. And off the back of that, history then learned, or we learned, actually we need to change this, and that's where murder with diminished
1957 diminished responsibility. It led to discussions over that because the barristers that were defending her brought up that subject of, I suppose, insanity. Because there wasn't such a term as diminished responsibility in law. But they brought up this idea that this woman's mind was so effective that she was beyond the ability to make a reasonable decision about it all. But it wasn't accepted because they said, well, there's no precedent in law for that. So it's not even accepted as an illness other than that you're absolutely insane.
Let me just frame it for people that don't know the case of Ruth Ellis, and I think it would be really useful for you two to then pick up on those parts. So Ruth Ellis was she'd been in some abusive
she was in a relationship with a racing car driver, and he was sort of a bit of a.
Oh, like yourself.
He was a wealthy man.
She'd been in an abusive relationship, and it had been abusive both ways. It had been abusive both ways, and there had been loss of a child and such like that. And it was a volatile situation. And then they were separated, and the guy didn't want anything to do with her really, and she was still very much wanted the relationship, a little bit infatuated potentially. I don't know, it wasn't there, but there was another guy that she was seeing as well, and the other guy that she was seeing almost egged her kind of on in terms of
supplying the firearm.
He did supply the firearm, but more than that, he took her and showed her how to use it and taught her how to shoot. He then drove her to the pub where the guy was. He waited in the car. She then got out, and then she shot. Shot him, I think, 5 times.
I thought it was 4, to be honest with you.
4 or 5 times. But she also shot the police officer.
Yeah.
Well, she accidentally shot the police officer in the thumb, who happened to be an off-duty police officer who was in the pub at the time, heard the gunshots, came outside,
arrested her,
got shot and lost his thumb, and then he arrested her. So she was somebody else supplied the weapon, showed her how to use it, encouraged her to do it, drove her to the actual to do the murder. Effectively, it's called a murder. And then she was the one that was arrested, charged, and the relationship she was in there as well was a volatile
the problem. The story's quite correct. The problem, but at the time that she was arrested, none of that evidence was available about him.
Yeah.
None of it. She never uttered that person's name. I forgot his name now, this new boyfriend. Never uttered his name once.
David Bleakley.
And she did mention it right there at the very end of the investigation of the trial. At the very, very end. I think she was actually been charged, convicted of murder, and she was awaiting the death sentence. And then she mentioned it, but it was never, ever taken up. Nobody followed that up after the event. Whether they decided that it was academic now, but she's been charged with murder, she did the killing, that'll do, and we're not bothered with the rest of it, or they just didn't believe her. I don't know, who knows? But it's only investigations after the event that story that you've got there come out. And they said these things are known things now. But because she never mentioned them, they had nothing to investigate. And remember, their powers of investigation, if you're going back to the 1950s, were not as sophisticated as they are today. They're just not. They would have found out where that gun come from, one way or the other. They'd have tracked that gun somehow. Today, you track it everywhere, and find out where you go.
Forensics.
And hang on, this doesn't seem right. Where did you get a gun from? I can't remember what she said, but they would have probably said, well, hang on, you know.
Well, I think
that trail of investigation would open things, wouldn't it? And her case and having that information come out was obviously a catalyst for discussion over people's responsibility.
And it was so open and shut.
Well, she never denied that. In court, she said, I intended to kill him.
Yeah, it was so open and shut. Because there was a police officer as well that had witnessed it, and there was other people there that had witnessed it. It was just so. She did it. There's no argument. Yeah. I will point out one thing with courts, and it was really interesting. I remember the first time I saw it.
Find with trials, particularly for murder and all the serious capital offence stuff like that, is that they always say that the judge will always say to the jury that you are to listen to the evidence and to take it away after the event and weigh it up based on the evidence. So you can decide what's a fact and what you, because they're allowed to decide what they believe and what they don't believe. You can't stop a jury doing that. But he said you must make your decision based on the evidence in front of you. And yet they go through a whole process. They end up having personality competitions. And they bring people on, they go, well, you were a good person, he did this and did that and did that. Go, well, then you were already trying to, I always say, convince the jury of someone's innocence or guilt based on their personalities now and a probability. And you go, well, you're not in court to do probabilities. There are two kinds of law in the country. In a civil court, a judge can convict somebody based on probability. Do I believe it happened? Do I think it's likely that it happens? I find you guilty at a criminal, not a criminal offence, a civil offence.
Yeah.
But in a criminal court, that's not allowed. They go, you can't do that based on probabilities. You have to say, what is the evidence in front of me? If there's any doubt, even on one thing in there, based on that, you should be able to come back with a not guilty verdict. Now, it was the same for prison staff, believe it or not. If we got charged with an offence within the prison system, and I think it's true of all civil servants, by the way, and public servants, if the people that do the adjudications, because it doesn't go to court, it's done within internally. So it won't be my governor, it'll be an independent governor with a bunch, I can get representation, they can. But if they believe that it's likely that I committed that offence, they can find me guilty.
Well, you say this in the reception
and
when they talk about prisoners' clothing and stuff.
Because I might have had a bit of a problem running with the governor a couple of years ago and always been seen as a challenging officer. I remember I was a union a guy at one stage, and I would go there represent the staff, and with the young, we'd have our, we was always good relationships, I must be honest, but we'd have our arguments and fun like that. But you don't know later on down the line, they go, well, I can convince this person you'll be convicted on a probability because he was a bit of a troublemaker. So it's likely that he would have done that. And I just go, I can't get my head around that idea that probability is good enough to convict.
Yeah, someone's opinion, isn't it, at the end of the day? When it's
and damage their life beyond repair.
And it doesn't happen in my world, in a business.
No, it doesn't.
I might be able to, or we would have an investigation if we thought, for example, you've been stealing. We'd have an investigation. But we'd have to prove it. If I went, you were on shift, you signed for it, it's not there, it's probable, and it is probable, you've stolen that money. That's not enough. I have to prove that you did.
It's one of the, I do remember some of those sort of rules from when I was in there, and always find it kind of hard to get my head on, and hard as well, but actually they're more, that almost gives you that feeling that they're more likely to throw you under a bus than actually help you as such.
You never know what the motivation at the higher levels are.
Yeah, what's the kind of motivation behind this? And it's like, as a civil servant, it's like, if you can, well, the probability is, my opinion is, so therefore we can just go down.
I mean, even though this is slightly off subject, there was a training school for prison officers many years ago, probably in the 80s, and the staff there were principal officers, I believe they were. You had to be a principal officer before you become a trainer. And then there was some investigation done. They said there had been some fraud on expenses. In other words, they were claiming for mileage they may not have done, more mileage, claiming for food that they weren't entitled to claim for. So it was all in.
So you're working with MPs then,
but the prison service sent it out to the police. And the police investigated it, and they went to and it took months and months and months to investigate. It's not over 12 months, 18 months. And they came back and they said, there's no case to answer. There's no case to answer. There is nowhere near enough evidence here for us to go to court and convict any one of these people, because there are about 10 people charged with it.
But this happens with MPs.
And the prison service said, thank you very much. And then they charged all the officers within the internal system and found them all guilty, and then took them all out of the training school, broke their ranks, if I remember rightly, broke their ranks and put them back into prisons as a punishment. But the police had said, well, there's no case. So I go, well, how come the prison service can decide that on a probability we know that you're guilty, but the police can't find any evidence? You go, that just flies in the face of what I call true justice.
I guess we found the downside of being a civil servant.
But it's nothing to do with that side. We're not talking about. We're talking about.
No, but I mean that does happen with MPs. We always see.
But it's about the evidence and the way we work it.
It comes back to that opinion and evidence stuff that we talked about right at the start of the show, where you were talking about how like the public will often be like, well, they can just get on with it. Why don't they just arrest them? It's like, well, actually, you need the evidence, and it's all well and good for someone who's not there judging a person, sentencing a person, sending a person down to be like, well, that's my opinion, just sentence them to prison, sentence them to death. I want this kind of punishment available. It's like, well, yeah, but you sit there in front of that person and make that judgment, and if you take the emotion out of it and look at actual evidence rather than just making a sweeping statement or an opinion based on how you're feeling at a point in time, then it's very different.
Well, years ago, prison officers were exempt from jury duty. And the reason they said they were exempted is because if this person, because you're not allowed to know as a jury member whether they've been in prison, whether they committed previous crimes until after the event. And they go, the danger we put in a prison officer, you might sit there and look at that person and not go, I know you. So they said you were exempt from that because you may know things about their history that we don't want the jury to understand, because you're only supposed to convict somebody on the evidence in front of you, not on past history.
And jury service is always local. You don't go all over the country.
But they're not exempt anymore. Prison officers are not exempt anymore. They can ask to be exempted on the grounds they might say, I know the person that's charged and I've known them for many years in jail. But if you go, well, I'm not aware of that person, then they might say, well, you can't be exempt anymore. But you see hundreds of thousands of prisoners. So you might go to court one day and not realise the person in front of there, but then they find out. They may find out one way or the other that when they go, oh, sorry, that's a done jury now. Why? Hung jury. Why? Because we found out that officer works in a prison, and we found out that prisoner has been to that jail. They might not know each other, but we don't know that. Once again, we can't take the risk. Once you infect something, it's like a bad apple in a barrel, isn't it? Once you infect something, doubt and suspicion.
But there are countries, and we used to do it in the Georgian times. We used to put people in prison based on hearsay. That's where hearsay comes from. And there is a case, I don't know if we'll pick up in the death penalty show that we do, but there was a case where somebody was executed for firing in the direction of a gameskeeper. Didn't even fire at him, but in the direction. And that was a case where a upper class person from society, a first class person, or very, very upper class, had turned around and said, that person over there shot in my direction. They were then put into prison and executed. And that was the evidence. That person did that. Because of the way society did.
This is a true story. When I was a young man, I lived in a little town in Wales called Montgomery. And there's a story there, and it still runs today as a sort of story. And there was a person running around, and there's a place, and there's a farm and a lake place called Limer. It's called Limer. There's lakes, small ponds, I should say, not lakes and all that. And one person was walking from a pub going home, and another person came along on a horse. And what happened was that person on that horse got killed. And it went to court because they took this person to court. I forgot his name now. Robert somebody, his name was. And he pleaded innocent. But they found him guilty of the crime, even though his argument was that this person was literally on the horse trying to beat him. And I don't know what he did, but this. So he was sentenced to death. And he said, I'm innocent. And as God is my witness, he said, for as long as I'm buried in that ground, he said, there will be no grass grow on my grave. So we used to run up there as kids to the church, because we know where it was, called the Robber's Grave. And we used to look at that, and it was always the shape of a bare cross. They'd put a rose bush in the middle, which is probably a reason why there's no grass that grows on it. But there was a small rose bush, about 2 foot high. But there was always that distinct, and you could see it wasn't manufactured. It was just that kind of piece of ground. I have no idea whether it's still there.
I don't think roses stop grass growing.
Yeah, it's the story of the Robber's Grave. You'd probably find it on the internet now. It's still local folklore, of course. Yeah.
Those kind of things I do find fascinating. I think those. I get absorbed in history.
So he was basically convicted on hearsay.
Yeah, and they do. It used to happen all the time. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to the executions, because obviously when we talk about executions, I'm sure we'll talk about modern executions or recent ones and current crimes and people that should or shouldn't be executed, depending on where you sit on the fence. But we'll also go back in time and talk about those that were for ridiculous crimes that probably, almost certainly, a good chunk were innocent. So we'll do that. I was going to pick up on the end, just really to finish on Ruth Ellis, because I think what was one of the things I find so, I guess, important about the Ruth Ellis case is that she was the victim that has almost certainly saved countless lives beyond that, because we all know that people do get convicted of crimes and then later on get found innocent. And she's one of those that, yes, she committed the crime, but it certainly didn't warrant a death sentence. But at the time, there was no choice. That's what the judge had to do. He had no option. I think he even said that he did that.
Mandatory death sentence.
We'll talk about that. But she was the catalyst for changing that decision. And unfortunately, and they do say, don't they, in army terms and stuff, the person that's first through the wall always gets bloodiest. And unfortunately, she was that first one through the wall. But because of that, we now do have a far better system in place. It's not perfect by any stretch of imagination, a far better system in place that actually will have prevented numerous people from actually being charged with murder, whether they were then killed or not, executed or not, or spending life in prison. But
you'll never find a perfect situation in any human society. You never will. That's just humanly impossible to do. What you've got to strive for is the best that you can get. That's all we can fight for, is the best that we can get. And you will always have to accept mistakes will be made, horrific things will happen, and we will deal with them in ways that many people disagree with or agree with. That's human nature.
People will always make mistakes. People will
always make mistakes.
There will always be people that have different interests, and there will always be people with different opinions.
I think sometimes we get, because there's so much media now, we think we can solve the problems, and we can't. We just have to accept that our job really is to keep it at its lowest level that it's absolutely possible to do. That's all you can ever do.
It's really interesting you say that, because I think my life, my entire life, both personally and professionally, but I think my life is aimed at solving problems, and I'm always like, I'm going to solve this problem. And maybe I can't. Maybe I just need to go, I'm just going to reduce this problem to as minuscule as I can.
Your aim is to solve it. Your aim is to solve it, accepting that you probably never will, but that aim keeps you driving and driving. It's the same with deaths on our roads. We have one of the safest records on our roads, believe it or not, because of things like seat belts and things like that, and good laws. And most people are good drivers and drive accordingly for their own safety, I mean, stuff like that. But we've always accepted that you'll never, ever go, there'll never be a zero figure.
No.
You just won't.
No, even if you don't have cars and you've got a horse and cart,
doesn't matter what you do.
People will still get killed by horse and carts.
Yeah. It doesn't matter what you do. So there's always, it's about keeping it at a level and go, it's not good, but we have to live within those things in life. And that's true when you look at manslaughter and murders and all those things. The reality is these are things that are happening in the world. Always have, always will.
Okay, let's bring it to a close there. Thank you very much for listening. This has been Life Behind Bars. We've been talking about manslaughter and murder with diminished responsibility today. If you want to send us any comments, any thoughts, any messages, any questions, please do. You can do that through the variety of social media channels we have for the shows and for ourselves individually. If you like the show, please subscribe. Feel free to share it. We'd like you to share it. If you don't like it, then just don't listen. It's that simple.
Oh, no, I'm going to get all their names and addresses and go around their houses.
Oh, God.
I spent 38 years in the prisons. I got a few contacts.
Yeah, I know. I've seen you do that with kids. I've seen you do that with kids. Go, kids, if you're good on a tour, Mum and Dad take you. He does this. I'm going to finish it here. He takes people on tours and he'll pull the kids out in the front and go, if you're really good over the next 2 hours, Mum and Dad are going to take you from McDonald's afterwards. And if they don't, you come back and tell me. Because I know people. So I've done this for a long time.
It's a complete lie. It's a complete lie. I do not say that.
It's a great tour. It's amazing. If you've not been on tour with Officer Goodwin, you absolutely should. They are amazing. That's not my job to do. That's a sponsor's job to do. Anyway, that has been the show. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.